To reform or not to reform our constitution, that is the emerging question out of the just concluded repeat presidential poll that took place on the 26th of October. I still have my guest with me. Shem, let's come to you because you mentioned that this is not just about positions and not just about electoral reform, but addressing historical injustices. For you, what specific changes are these that you would be looking towards that may not necessarily be electoral related?
Yvonne, by declaring interest, I'm part of a group called which believes in Kenyans dialoguing, Tushauriane wa Kenya. And some of the colleagues you've mentioned, Honorable Kabogo and others, we're together part of that group with other actors from other segments of society. I think the premise is some of the changes that are required, there could be short-term changes which may or may not necessarily require constitutional amendments. Some of the 5 areas we're currently critically looking at as part of the Tushauriane group are, first, we recognize, as my brother Mule said, devolution is a gold mine that the Constitution gave us, but maybe we haven't utilized it quite effectively. So our first point that we're currently looking at has got to do with devolution. Something that can be done is how can we increase, instead of minimum 15% allocations going to the counties, why don't we make it minimum 40%? That can be done without necessarily changing the constitution. But also, when the resources go to the counties, how do we ensure that they're used for the intended purposes, but also a larger chunk goes into development rather than the bulk of it going into recurrent budget. So that's one item that we're looking at. The second item we're looking at squarely addresses the issue of exclusion. The way government has been structured, there was no doubt that it didn't quite reflect the face of Kenya. So to deal with that, one, of course, would then look at merit, equity, as well as diversity. Because even as we talk of equity and merit, obviously, if you have 10 best doctors coming just from one community, you would have a problem with that. And when we talk of equity and inclusion, we're not just looking at national government alone. The same trickles down to county level. We do know that there are minorities within some county governments which feel excluded. So we would prefer to have equity and inclusion at the 2 levels. Thirdly is perhaps the issue that Bishop Wanyike was talking about, the aspect of not just sharing positions. For us, we look at it more of how do we improve oversight. Improving oversight means you must have a strong opposition. And this, again, applies both at the national and county levels. There are some of our members who have said, why don't we institutionalize the official shadow cabinet or shadow government to the effect that you'd have opposition leader, deputy, and then his or her cabinet. And why do we say also at the county level? Because there has been problems of misappropriation of resources at county levels. If you had the runner-up being an official gubernatorial leader, then with, of course, a small lean cabinet, then they would keep on check the current governors. The fourth area that we're discussing is the historical injustices. And Agenda 4 specifically. I'm being careful not to talk about the TJRC, the Truth, Justice, Reconciliation Report. Some have the view that currently emotions are still so high that we cannot effectively discuss it. But things like, there are certain historical injustices that we can talk about as of now. It's unfortunate that in 2007, after positions were created, people forgot about Agenda 4. And finally, Yvonne, we are keen on the issue of improving our electoral systems. I think this is what NASA 2 has been talking about. And we're not just looking at presidential alone. We do know that, although not many talk about it, gubernatorial, parliamentary elections, there were contested elections. And we're not just looking at the election itself. We take the position that you cannot have a free and fair election if party primaries, for example, are not free and fair. And you can also not have a free and fair election if 30% of eligible voters, including diaspora, and people don't have ideas, are left out. So we're looking at that comprehensive proposition.
Okay, Shem, that is indeed comprehensive. And Bishop, you also mentioned that this isn't just about the positions that you talked about, Prime Minister, 2 deputy premiers as well, and the official leader of the opposition. But there's a sense in which, you know, when you talk about dialogue, and you've seen both sides of the political divide saying they're opposed to a nusu mkate type of argument, which many would see, you know, your proposals to be. Before you answer that, I'd like us to listen to Njonjo Mwe, who talked about such talks centering around individuals and it just being about a select few and not about Kenyans. Let's listen to him first.
We do not want an elite pact between politicians because that's what has tended to happen when this country confronts a crisis. We allow politicians to run away with it. They make deals that suit them and the people are left behind to play catch-up. And we don't normally play that catch-up very well once that train has left the station. Right now, we are saying that we are the people. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, the sovereign will of the Republic of Kenya belongs to the people. And we can exercise it either directly or through our elected and appointed representatives.
So, Bishop, how do we make this an all-inclusive conversation that isn't just about, quite frankly, Uhuru, Raila, Ruto, you know, all these names that continue to come up in the political sphere?
I think we have to accept, Yvonne, that we have a high polarized society which is keen to look into perceptions, and perceptions do create kind of impressions and decisions in this country. And our concern as a council is how can we cure those negative perceptions in regard to how leadership and governance is picked up in this country. So our discussion of expanding and including those who may want to join the president is trying to cure the negative perceptions of how leadership is conceived, and not just looking at the big political parties, but those who can accept to align themselves within the current governance after a president is sworn in, and looking into the broader platform and the perceptions which are due to arise from the different communities we have in the country. And this is what we are looking at. How can we discuss on how leadership can be taken without necessarily looking at people from those political parties, perhaps, which may have those who may be focal. But what about communities who may align themselves to a particular political persuasion in this country and a particular leader whom they argue in regard to the choices and the decisions that they may want, have him excluded in the overall governance of this country? And so it is not looking into a nusu mkate, but strengthening a government of the day, and at the same time recognizing how can the opposition also play and contribute its role both in parliament, while those from other communities and political parties who may join a president, how can they strengthen the checks and balances or accountability as indicated by Shem, and how can we cure so that we will not have a political leadership in this country which will feel that it is excluded to the extent that we will always be running out in the streets, our economy running down, lives lost, and political grandstanding happening within this country.
Okay, Bishop.
So this is the proposal that we are looking into. Yes.
Bishop, allow me to interject. How would you then structure the talks in a way that these big political players and names that dominate our politics aren't exactly the focal point? That this ceases to be a discussion. So what I'm asking is, who would be in the talks? How would we get that? There's been proposals that, listen, these talks can happen through Parliament because that is where, we have our representation. But who exactly would be seated at this table to make sure that this ceases to be about 2 individuals that have dominated our politics in this country today?
Yvonne, our take and our statement is very clear that we are looking at a coalition that forms with the winning party. So in this case, we are not looking for a discussion between, for the sake of argument, between Raila and the president, Uhuru Kenyatta, but rather a people who can discuss with the president as a coalition and not specifically looking at persons, but a people who can argue a particular political line of thought and providing checks and balances within the country. So it is not so much as X and Y in order to form XY, but rather enlarging governance and holding it accountable to the political choices that there are in this country. Okay. This is a proposal that we are actually looking forward into.
All right, thanks. Mule, so again, the same question to you. Who should be seated at the negotiating table? And consider this, is this even the right moment to have a conversation like this one? I will read for you a couple of tweets in just a moment where people are saying we're not interested in talks, we just want credible polls, we do not want Nusumkate. If you take a look at all of these other groups and individuals, the Multisectoral Forum attempted to have these talks before October the 26th. The coalition or the caucus that Shemo Chodho is talking about, you know, had received some serious backlash, even on social media, from both sides of the divide. Is this the right atmosphere to talk?
Well, I don't know whether... I know for a fact there's a crisis in the country and that this crisis has to be solved one way or the other. I like the points which are being espoused here. Shem is given some very, very good points in terms of how we can be able to move forward. But I think we have a trigger moment. If we were to move from a point of being moved, then the election which has happened, or the two elections which have happened very close to each other, should be a trigger moment to be able to initiate a thinking through in terms of how we can be able to engage. One of the things that we've called for is an evaluation of the election process, an audit of this election process. And that audit is supposed to be, according to us, able to unearth all the issues that we'd want to lay to the table and start having a discussion. Does that offer the trigger moment or the opportunity from whence other major issues that have been put on the carpet can become a national conversation? That could be it. But I think there is an opportunity that we have at the moment. Remember, history proves that in moments of crisis, there's always an opportunity for people to be able to quickly engage. It may not be a sober moment to be able to grasp with some of the very sensitive issues, as Shem has highlighted in terms of like the TJRC report, but we use the opportunity that we have. We have an election which has been disputed. We have seen Kenyans boycotting a national election. That is the moment. And I think if we do a complete evaluation and audit of the process that we have seen that so far, a number of issues are going to need attention. And from there, the conversation can be broadened into the political issues that we've talked about earlier.
Allow my skepticism for a moment, because even in speaking about historical injustices, you know, even Shem says that is a sensitive conversation to have. Now, 2017, 10 years after the post-election violence that we saw in 2007, 2008, we have never really been able to talk about the TJRC report because for all this time, it has continued to be sensitive. You're talking about an audit of the election. We have done audits of the election before, several times. So how would these talks be different in a way to ensure that we are talking today and sorting out these issues once and for all? Certainly, I think even Kenyans are fatigued. We've been here before, we've talked, we've created great reports. We don't implement them. It's still such a sensitive topic. What will make it less sensitive now for us to be able to have an open, honest conversation, Mule?
Well, and I have a number of colleagues, of course, who've commented on this. They say some of them feel that it's just plain bad manners that we have as a country, that we cannot be able to pick up our pieces every time there have been problems. But still, every opportunity that arises, and we've seen, I think why I'm saying this should be a catalyst is the fact that there was a major statement over these two elections. A major statement, an opportunity or a crisis that nearly took us to a civil strife. Now, if that is not a reckoning moment that's supposed to make a nation aware and conscious that it needs to address some of the problems that it is facing, then I don't know really, maybe we are doomed.
Mole, we had a moment of reckoning in 2007. Over 1,000 people died, hundreds of thousands were displaced. Surely if that's not reckoning, I don't know what is.
Well, and all these have been moments, and I agree with you, that should have been a reckoning moment. We sat down, we had hoped, and I think that is where we are at the moment, that based on the discussions and implementation of some part of the agendas, as Shem was saying, part of the agendas which are addressed in the immediate period after the 2007 election seem to only address issues of the power politics, and we never got to the deeper end of things. This is a reminder 10 years down the line that we have done nothing. And these indicators have been there because quite a number of analysts and stakeholders out there have kept on talking about going back to 2007 and looking at that, the issues which had been brought out by that particular crisis much more comprehensively. It has not happened. I think it's another opportunity now. We are reminded about this. We can be able to start with the elections that we have just seen, which are fresh. I think the premise that we were given by the Supreme Court on the 1st of September, where they were brave enough as an institution to be able to annul an election, an African election, is a good starting point. So there's a narrative that has begun. If that be the first narrative, and the second narrative, a major boycott of an election, that is a start of things for me.
All right, I want us to start having our final comments now. So I'll ask my last question to each of you. Shem, I want to begin with you. You talked about the 4 issues: devolution, perhaps 40% to the counties, exclusion, oversight, and historical injustices. Why do we need to talk to solve all of these issues? Why not just implement the TJRC report? When it comes to devolution, surely this is something that can be passed in Parliament. Exclusion, we even have the NCIC, for heaven's sake. So why do we need to talk? It seems like all of these solutions already exist. Just dust them up and implement them.
Yvonne, one of our senior members sent me the message to you, especially for the great work you're doing, and other ladies. And she said, this is Ambassador Peter Gitau, our former ambassador to Namibia. He said, request them to continue being the Esthers, the biblical Esther. You know, Esther in the Bible brought about, spearheaded pacifying communities. And he appreciates what you've been doing. We hope that continue being the case. But having said that, I think it's important to recognize, as my colleagues have said, we are sitting on a precipice. We have here 2 major coalitions. One coalition believes, and maybe rightly so, that they have been through the electoral process as per the Constitution, that their victory was taken away by the Supreme Court, and that it's time that they be allowed to implement their manifesto and rule the country. On the other hand, there is the other party that feels that the election was stolen in August. The Supreme Court pronounced itself and talked about things to be improved, that they were not improved, and they have boycotted the election. And in the process, a number of lives have been lost. So there is a serious problem that we have, and that the 2 sides are not, for the time being, able to see eye to eye. But I want to remind the 2 coalitions that it's just the other day they were requesting Kenyans for votes. At that time, it's like we, the ordinary Kenyans, were their bosses. I think they need to listen to the voice of reason. If Kenyans say we need to have dialogue, I think I want to make that passionate appeal. It needs to be done. And what the dialogue that some of us have in mind has to be inclusive. So all these different groups, whether it's We the People, or it's the Citizens Alliance, or it's the People's Assembly, or whichever other group it may be, multi-sectoral forum and all, we think all these groups, they're all Kenyans. They need to come together with the principles on both sides and more, as well as Kenyans outside the country. We need to have a conversation that's going to help us heal the problems. But yes, in terms of why don't we just address the TJRCs, Yvonne, I do recognize, again, there's quite a polarization here. There are those who don't want to see, they don't want to hear any evil. They don't see anything wrong at all. They start wondering. But there are those who are bleeding. So we must bridge the gap. But I think the best way to deal with it is, first, let's start to dialogue. Within the dialogue, we can say, okay, there are 10 issues to be tackled in the historical injustices. Can we just deal with the first 2 in this short term? Because we must have a short-term solution, immediate term, as well as a long-term and medium-term solution. So the short term could take 2, and then you say the other 8, which are so hot, let's deal with them as we go along.
All right, thank you for that. Bishop, how will you get everybody on the table? There's such division, such polarization. In fact, Wafula Chebukati raised this in one of the 5 questions when he was making his final announcement. I think it was his second question. He asked, what are the roots of polarization in Kenya? So, from the cleric's point of view, how are you going to get everybody down on the table and cool down the temperatures in the country right now?
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I think for me as a church minister, I have both those who are pro the opposition or pro the government. And it is very painful when you preach to a congregation that is divided, and yet at the same time we share Eucharist, which is a focal point of bringing us together. And so why it is important for us as church leaders that there is need for national conversation is that I have both political divide, the wounded, those who appear denied positions, excluded, and those who are happy because they are in the government. And our desire as church leaders is to see the same people that we give Eucharist, which is a symbol of unity, yet at the same time, we have those political aspirations and desires don't appear divided when we are out into the market. And when we are in the church, it's like we are actually playing or acting. This is the challenge that every church leader has. And the call for conversation and reflection of our constitutional instruments over how governance can happen in this country is a valid point which requires reflection, so that I will be happy to stretch my hand after Eucharist to somebody who shares different political views and yet at the same time does not feel excluded there in the church because of somebody who has a different position and seems to have taken everything in his or in her plate.
Okay, all right. So for you, Bishop, it begins in the church and maybe then starts to spread out. All right, Mule, you have the final word in just about a minute. Where do we go from here and how do we start to move forward, whatever that would be, even as we await whatever constitutional process may take place in the next 14 days?
Well, I think the first thing is that from the line of questioning, I get a sense that very many people may be feeling this is a romantic idea. I don't think it's romantic for people to have died between August and the 26th, that a nation boycotted elections, that a Supreme Court annulled elections, historic activities in this country, historic happenings in this country. I think it's a very good opportunity for this country to be able to come together and try to heal as a nation. We have elections. I think that's a very good trigger point. We shall push as ILOG for election reforms, which address very many things, including even gender representation within our public offices. I think this discussion needs to start. It's a good thing that the president has talked about it, the opposition leader has talked about it, religious leaders are talking about it, the civil society is talking about it. So already a national conversation is beginning. It just needs to take shape.
Thank you very much. Mule Musau, Bishop Julius Wanyoike, as well as Dr. Shem Ochodo. Gentlemen, I thank you for that conversation tonight. Hopefully, the start of many to come. I want to leave you right now on the big story with this shot from the iconic Uhuru Park, where on the 27th of August 2010, we promulgated the Constitution we currently have. This flag should perhaps give us some pause for thought, even as we continue to have this great, robust debate in the country right now. This is the big story tonight. I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. Good night.